You might find it hard to believe that yours truly actually once appeared in the musical Annie. I mean, I was 12 and it was compulsory to graduate primary school, and I was one of 100 students who were shoehorned into the thing, but I was in it. And if you don't know the musical, it's set in New York during the Great Depression, and there's a shantytown called Hooverville made up of wealthy people now made poor by the Depression, and they sing a sarcastic song called "We'd Like to Thank You, Mr. Hoover."
We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover.
And this is the unfortunate legacy that Hoover has left behind. Having entered office as a rich businessman that everyone aspired to be, he left as the guy who did nothing in response to the stock market crash and allowed the Depression to worsen. But this isn't the only way that people view Hoover. On the American right, there's an increasing but still minority view that Hoover worsened the Depression by meddling too much with the economy. Take PragerU for example.
My research shows that it was Hoover's incessant meddling, not the mistaken view that he did nothing, that provoked the Great Depression.
And so in this video, we'll be answering the question, how should Herbert Hoover really be remembered?
Hello there.
Okay, so today we'll be looking at the Hoover administration's response to the Great Depression, and while we're at it, let me know in the comment section below who you think was the best US president and why. Make sure to also subscribe for regular videos on the most important topic in modern history, China under the Communist Party. And spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that Hoover failed not because he did stuff. I mean, during the COVID crisis, nearly all governments recognized the need for intervention, like stimulus packages, including a Republican president who signed off on mega tax cuts just 2 years earlier.
I am asking Congress to amend this bill and increase the ridiculously low $600 to $2,000.
Instead, I'm going to argue that the stuff his administration did was just incorrectly applied. And hey, look, we have over a century of financial crisis to learn from, and if I was in Hoover's shoes, I'd probably have spent the entire treasury on buying the world supply of the greatest game of all, and then would have held the world ransom to get back their Nintendogs, so I can't exactly throw stones. So in terms of Hoover's beliefs, he was a believer in rugged individualism, in that one's wealth was a product of their life choices, and that it would be bad for society to have people dependent on government income. Interestingly though, he genuinely seemed to have some degree of faith that Americans would provide charity to those who needed it. He himself gave large swathes of money to charity and refused to take a presidential salary. When eventually he was required to take the salary by law, he donated all of that money to charity. The theory was that if you knew your check came from a charity rather than a nameless government, you'd be less inclined to waste the money, and pride would make you want to become less dependent on that charity. However, as the early depression continued and unemployment grew to 25%, no one wanted to give away money because they either didn't have a job or believed that they were about to lose their job. The rugged individualism theory perhaps also misjudged human nature. In Australia, uni students moan about being poor when in reality they're almost certainly in the top 2% of wealthy people in the world, so it's hardly surprising that rugged individualism did not bring about the distribution of money needed to raise a country out of an early recession. But Hoover still did actually do things to try and fix the Depression, it just didn't work. Following the stock market crash in October, Hoover held November conferences and met with key business leaders. He encouraged them to avoid layoffs and create job sharing if possible, and in return he'd lobby Congress for lower taxes. Initially this was well received, and Henry Ford even agreed to spend $25 million increasing staff wages to $7 a day. By mid-1930, things started to fall apart. The November conferences could only ever temporarily keep things afloat because once one business started to cost cut through wages, they had a competitive advantage over other businesses, and so everyone else had to follow suit. Not to mention that businesses had long been cost cutting in other ways, causing gross investment to fall by 29% between 1929 and 1930. In terms of the agricultural sector, they had been in depression for over a decade. Basically, the destruction of European farms in World War I gave America a huge export market, and they produced much more to sell to Europe. When the war ended, America was left with many crops, but much fewer people to sell to, causing a huge oversupply and low prices. And Hoover's Federal Farm Board actually made things worse and not better. Basically, this initiative gave $47 million of aid to farmers who had long suffered from the low prices in an effort to stabilize the price. But this only made things worse as they used that money to produce even more crops, causing prices to plummet further. 25% of farmers also couldn't use this money for produce as they'd lost their farms in the Depression already. Hoover then turned to the Grain Stabilization Corporation to buy wheat from farmers and then store it away to artificially decrease the supply. Initially, this seemed to work as prices rose to 18 cents above the rest of the world, but then all the buyers decided, you know what, that excess wheat will eventually return to the market, causing prices to drop, so let's just wait it out.
No, let me explain. No, you don't understand. No, I didn't mean... No, I didn't understand. No.
They did exactly that, and when it returned, prices plummeted to 40 cents per bushel. The Hoover administration's final attempt to fix the agricultural problem was to implement the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. Well, technically this was Congress, but Hoover campaigned on this and approved of the act. It came into effect in June of 1930 and placed a tax on agriculture and then eventually everything else that came from other countries. In 1932, the import tax was as high as 59.1%. Now, this was designed to protect the agricultural industry by forcing Americans to buy produce domestically, but it really failed. You might have heard the expression, a tariff is a tax on every other industry, as businesses have to hike up prices to accommodate for the more expensive domestic goods that they've been coerced into buying.
All tariff is a tax that is being placed on everyone else for the benefit of some.
Now, the general estimate is that these tariffs reduced global trade by 65% between 1929 and 1934, vastly worsening the depression for everyone, including America. Again, ask North Korea if having to trade entirely internally is conducive to good economic growth. Finally, when it came to the business sector, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a last-ditch effort just before the election to create some economic growth, but again, this failed. Basically, hundreds of millions of dollars were given as loans to banks, I guess you could call it a bailout, and it stopped a few banks from failing, and in a pre-Glass-Steagall era, if the bank failed, you failed, so I guess that was a success. But its goal was to stimulate economic growth, and it certainly didn't do that. No one really felt that this was prime time to start, say, their pottery business, and many feared getting themselves debt-trapped like those who lost their money in the 1929 stock market crash. 50% of the money also made its way to 7% of the population, so it was only really helpful in protecting banks rather than reinvigorating the entire economy. And to finish with, perhaps the most infamous policy of Hoover's was to ramp up taxes and increase the corporate tax rate by 15%. Now, I think corporate taxes are broadly good for making sure public services are properly funded, and I also don't really buy the argument that big tax cuts always lead to businesses hiring more people and then stimulating the economy. However, when the corporate tax rate jumps up by 15%, a lot of people lose their jobs. Put it this way, if your employers announced a downturn in profits by 15%, you'd be reasonably concerned for your job. Along with these tax hikes, the top income tax rate went from 25% to 63%.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Look, most Americans had no idea about the mechanics behind the economy and just knew that they weren't able to feed their kids. FDR smashed Hoover in the 1932 election, taking 89% of the Electoral College, but I genuinely do feel really sorry for Hoover. Hoover didn't cause the Depression. A combination of relaxed economic policies under Coolidge and Harding, American greed, and people taking stupid loans trying to get rich quick did. While times were good, most Americans were extremely greedy. As a private citizen, Hoover actually wasn't. Then when times went bad, those people who once were so greedy were so quick to criticize someone who was trying to fix things without a wealth of previous economic crises to learn from. Many failed to realize that their greed helped precipitate this crisis, and Hoover was simply someone who just didn't have the ideas to fix the issue that they had put America in. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button and comment below with your favorite US president. Mine personally is Jimmy Carter. I don't know if he's the best, but as an Australian, I appreciated his administration's efforts to pursue peace and not drag us into wars to help protect America's position as the top dog. Make sure to tune in this Friday for Enemies of the West as we look at Thomas Sankara, the Che Guevara of Africa. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.